Hi, good afternoon. Again, my name is Dana Thompson. I'm a project officer for the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council, and I want to thank you for joining us today. This is the last session for today. Tomorrow we'll be starting again at 9 o'clock in the morning. And if you'd like to join in a discussion, ask any questions, just write a comment. You can do that in the chat section, or if you specifically want to make sure you ask a question, you could put that in the Q&A box. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our session, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. And I will turn it over to Lydia to introduce herself and get us started. Thanks, Lydia.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. Hi, everyone. So a little bit about my background. I'm the Trauma and Addiction Program Coordinator for the Erie Field Office of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. I'm also trained in trauma treatment for children and teens, which I was a trauma therapist prior to my work at USCRI. And so I bring a lot of different lenses to the work that I do currently. I bring this kind of trauma-informed lens from my previous work and my training and education. But then working with refugees and immigrants, we also are hyper aware of the importance of cultural sensitivity and kind of addressing those needs. And within that, within kind of applying both of those lenses, is inherent the need to address intersectionality. So those three concepts in and of themselves could probably be their own presentation entirely. But I think that sometimes talking about them together can be really helpful in kind of synthesizing this information and making it more accessible, more like applicable. And so we're gonna go through this together. Bear with me. Please feel free to chat or interrupt, or if I'm saying something and there's something in the chat that needs to be addressed, please, Dana or someone, interrupt me. And this can be very conversational. This doesn't have to be just me talking endlessly. In fact, I would prefer it not be. But so without further ado, I'll just kind of jump in. But again, like I said, if something's not making sense, please feel free to stop me and we'll dive deeper, because these are complex the topics and this is a complex conversation. So we'll start with the idea of intersectionality. It's not necessarily a new idea, although it can be new for some people. It definitely was new to me prior to going to college. So intersectionality was developed, it was a concept developed by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. And originally it was applied to the intersection of both racial and gender identities. So how being a Black woman was different than being a Black man or a white woman, and how those that intersection of identities creates its own unique experiences, that it was not just being Black and being a woman, but that being both at the same time creates its own experience entirely. And I think that when we expand upon it, can be really powerful in how we view other types of identities and other experiences of people that we work with, or people that we are, or people that we care about. And so we can use that to talk about race and gender, like I said, but we can use it to talk about class or socioeconomic status, or religion, or disability, or sexual orientation, or in my work, country of origin, English language proficiency, or trauma backgrounds, right? That these are all different identities or experiences we have, and when they intersect in unique ways, they create entirely different experiences of systems that we might think are equitable, or might think we all have the same experience with, but these systems become very different when we have a different intersection of identities. So to think about that lens as we talk through the rest of this presentation, I also want to identify that not only are these identities interconnected, but that, like I said, that identity, trauma, and cultural sensitivity as concepts are also interconnected. I can't be trauma informed without also being culturally sensitive. if I'm truly trying to apply the ideas of being sensitive to someone's trauma experience, then I should be sensitive to someone's cultural experience too, because that might be interconnected as well. And same with identity and privilege. And then at the end of this presentation, I do intentionally, every time I talk about this, want to include an action step. I think it's so important that we address how to put this information into action, how to make it tangible, how to make it practical, because sometimes we focus so much on talking about how important these concepts are that we forget to say, like, and here's what you do with it. So hopefully we'll make sure that we're all on the same page with these general concepts to begin with, but then we'll take some time to really talk about how do we apply this, and not only how do we apply it with one-on-one situations like in a therapy session or in some sort of counseling or social work setting, but also how do we apply it to groups or organizations we're a part of, or even within bigger contexts of policy and community organizing. So that's kind of where we'll be starting. The first piece that we'll start with is this idea of identity and privilege, that kind of the roots of intersectionality. And so where I like to start with it is with privilege. And I say the P word because I think sometimes people carry a lot of baggage when it comes to the word privilege. I think sometimes conversations around privilege can happen in an incomplete or almost haphazard way sometimes. And so we talk about privilege and people walk away feeling uncomfortable or ashamed or angry. But really privilege is just an awareness we can have, and then a responsibility we can have, and a tool we can use to, fight for justice or fight for equity. And so the best way I've heard privilege discussed is actually not in talking about it in real terms, but in talking about it in an analogy. So the analogy is, tomorrow we all wake up and we're all assigned the task of getting to work. And some of us are assigned a car and some of us are assigned a bicycle. And we're all told to get to work on time. Now, those of us in a car will get to work on time pretty quickly, pretty easily. Those of us assigned to a bicycle may take longer. We may experience the elements more severely because we don't have the buffer of a car. And the obstacles in our way, right? A car can go over a pothole and it might just, kind of jostle the car, but overall the car will keep going. If a bicycle hits a pothole, they might get thrown from their bike completely. In fact, most of our roads are built for cars. So the road itself is made for the car. So the car travels it more easily. Whereas many of our roads don't even have a bike lane. So a bicycle has to kind of make their own way, or cars have to move around the bicycle, which can be stressful. And in this analogy, if we were to come head to head with someone, if someone in a car were to collide with someone in a bicycle, that would be really harmful to the person on the bicycle, but the person in the car would most likely be fine. And to kind of pull ourselves out of this analogy for a moment, if we think about being in a car as having privilege of any kind, so whether we're talking about privilege as being a man or being born cisgender, which is being born with the gender identity that you identify with, or the sex with the gender identity you identify with, or being born, Christian in a Christian dominant society, or being born white in a society that privileges whiteness. So those are all being in the car, right? And being on a bicycle is anything that is historically and currently disadvantaged by many systems. So whether that's being a person of color or having a disability or being a woman or being transgender or being gender non-binary or being Muslim or things like that, that these aren't bad things. I hope I'm not, being misunderstood, but that these are things that our systems were not created for these people. Our systems don't support some of these identities, or sometimes actively disadvantage them. We can see that statistically happen in a lot of systems, like our criminal legal system. And so what happens though, right, is sometimes when we have a different identity that's privileged, as a white person, I go through life thinking, I've earned all these things, and I very well may have, but there might be certain barriers, certain potholes that I didn't notice that I was able to overcome because I was in my car. I had a privileged identity. Whereas someone on a bicycle maybe was thrown from their bike when they went over that pothole. An example I use is when I was in high school, I got a speeding ticket and I had to go to the local magistrate, and I was sitting in my Catholic school girl uniform because it was before school and I had to go, and I was sitting there in the waiting room, and an attorney representing someone else entirely. I was there with my dad or something. No one was there representing us. A different attorney said, "You look like you don't belong here. I'll represent you for free and I'll, get this taken care of." And back then, I was just so concerned with my own well-being and my own whatever that I was just so grateful. Like, yeah, I don't belong here. I'm just a dumb kid and I, won't ever speed again. And yes, please help me. And I was grateful. After having gone to college and gotten my master's and gone through all this sort of like educational awareness, I realized, what did that mean that I did not look like I belonged there? What a privilege for someone to look at me and say, you don't look like you belong in the criminal legal system. You don't look like you belong in jail. Because if that is true, then the opposite is also true, that someone does look like they belong there. Someone does look like they belong in the criminal legal system. Someone does look like they belong in prison or jail. And what does that mean, right? Was it because I was in my Catholic schoolgirl uniform? Was it because I was a little blonde white girl with blue eyes? Was, what was it? And I could speculate, but in hindsight, I sometimes wonder if I had been any different constellation of identities, would I have had that same response? So there's one example where I was in my car and I hit a pothole, a speeding ticket, but I was able to overcome it, and I didn't get points on my license. I didn't get my license removed, and I didn't experience any sort of the major negative consequences that could have accompanied something that I actually did, that I would have deserved having to deal with, but I got like a free pass, maybe because, I think because of my privilege, my white privilege. And so not everyone experiences that. And it's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something that we've done anything to earn, right? I didn't earn my whiteness. I was just born white. I didn't choose it, just like in our analogy. We just woke up one day and someone gave us a car, gave us a bike. We didn't choose it. So it's not something we have to feel ashamed of, but it is something we have to be responsible for. Just like if we're driving down the road and someone's riding a bicycle and someone's driving in a car, if I'm driving down my road and I see a bicyclist, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to change the way I'm driving. I'm going to keep driving the same way I always drive. And, oh, well, they'll have to figure it out because they're riding a bicycle on my road. Like, no, because I understand that if a bicycle and a car collide, the bicyclist gets really hurt and I won't cause that harm to someone. And so I move my car and I give them a buffer. And so similarly, when you have privilege, there's a responsibility to be more aware of how our actions affect other people, or how policy or systems affect other people, and to just be more critically aware of that. More so, and when we collide with someone, I like to postulate, or I like to think like, okay, if I were to get in an accident with and see an accident between a person driving a car and person on a bike, the person in the car would never get out of their car and say, why on your bike, why is your arm broken? My arm's not broken. Why are you complaining about a broken arm? I didn't break my arm. Why are you? Because we know that a bicyclist doesn't have the same protection as a car. But we see that happen all the time, where when people with privilege kind of come in conflict with people with a marginalized or kind of historically marginalized identity, that they say, well, like, why are you offended by this? That didn't offend me. Why are you offended? Why are you upset by this? And the whole point is like, well, of course you're not offended. Like, you have the buffer of your privilege, right? You just don't understand. And I think that that's something we can struggle with all in our own ways, depending on our intersection of identities, is that discomfort in not knowing exactly how someone else feels. We like to think that we know everything, and we like to be kind of in control and the most knowledgeable, but there are things that we just don't understand. There are experiences that we just won't have. And we have to be able to kind of have that flexibility and that humility to accept when someone says, you know, well, that's not okay, or that was offensive, or that, you know, is harmful to people, even if maybe we don't personally understand that sort of harm. And we don't have to shame ourselves or other people for not being aware of their own privilege. Privilege creates a bubble and a buffer around us so that we don't see it. And that's what makes it so insidious, so kind of sneaky, that it can affect so many different systems in our lives because it creates this bubble. We don't see it, you know, everything's made to kind of keep us, you know, closed to that idea. And so when someone pops that bubble and we have to see our privilege, it can be uncomfortable. But it's not something we need to be ashamed of. It's not something we should shame other people for not being aware of, but it is something that we need to like grow and stretch ourselves to see more and to accept and to kind of sit in that discomfort, because it's really important for this ongoing kind of growth and conversation that we want to have around, you know, trauma-informed care and cultural sensitivity, right? If I approach everything with like, well, that wouldn't upset me if it happened to me, why are you upset by this trauma? Like, that's not helpful. And that's not going to help us kind of come to common ground. So I think a piece of this, and we'll come back to this when we talk about cultural sensitivity later, is humility, and this idea that if we can bring humility to it, whether it's talking about privilege and identities or trauma or cultural sensitivity, that humility is a really powerful tool that I think when I say it, it sounds really simple. It sounds kind of silly to even say in a presentation, like, oh, we'll just be humble. But I think we don't say it enough and we don't practice it enough. So I hope that this is kind of a reminder to kind of take a step back and have some humility and like, okay, maybe I'm not seeing this the same way because of my privilege or because of my experiences. So hopefully so far we're all good. It's all making sense. Like I said, you know, stop me if there's anything. So this, I just want to pose for a moment, you know, how different identities and their intersections can create like very different experiences of systems, whether we're talking, like I said, like the criminal legal system, or whether we're talking about the school system or social services, anything, even, you know, like an online learning platform. You know, our experiences can be so shaped by our identities and what barriers we face as a result. So these examples, you know, and these are all based loosely on like people that I know directly. Obviously not, you know, any identifiable information. It's all pretty abstract. But the first is a Ukrainian refugee woman who speaks limited English, has a college degree, and has no trauma history. The second is an Eritrean refugee man who speaks limited English, doesn't have a car, but had a driver's license in Egypt, has trauma history involving the loss of one of his legs. A Chinese immigrant woman who speaks English fluently, is attending college in the US, has a car, and no major trauma history. A US-born white woman with a college degree and no trauma history. And a US-born Black man with criminal record from adolescence, pursuing a college degree with extensive trauma history prior to and during experiences in prison. So these were just some examples of people I've worked with and thinking about where they came from. So for people that don't know, like Ukrainian woman is from like Eastern Europe, you know, is pretty fair skinned, a white woman, but an Eritrean man is darker complected, is a Black or brown man. So even in that experience, right, these two refugee people might have very different experiences of the United States as being resettled as they walk through a community. You know, someone might look, quote unquote, look like they belong, and someone might not. Or someone might be able to blend in and someone might not, depending on the community that they're resettled in. You know, things that I think when you don't work with a refugee or immigrant population, it's really easy to forget that some people don't speak English or some people don't read English. And there's like a very big gap sometimes in that I've worked with so many clients that speak perfect English, but if you put a form in front of them in English, they wouldn't be able to read a word of it. And sometimes if you're not aware of that, or if you haven't worked with that before, that can be like a shock to you. Like, how can they speak and not read it? And so I think that that's just another layer of awareness too, that these are just different layers of identities and barriers and experiences and strengths and assets too, right? That being able to speak a different language is a strength. And the more we can do to highlight those experiences or those assets can be really powerful when we're working with people or organizing or just being connected to people. So the next little chunk of this, we'll talk a little bit about trauma. So when we talk about trauma, I think people tend to think of trauma as something that happens directly to us. I think we typically think about like physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, maybe even neglect, or like violence of some kind, community violence, things like that. But trauma can be a lot of different things. Trauma can even include like witnessing a natural disaster. So seeing a tornado, rip through your town is traumatic. It's traumatizing. But even beyond that, you don't have to experience a trauma firsthand to be affected by it. I'm sure we can all relate to something that's happened in our lives that even just hearing about the trauma was upsetting. Even hearing about a trauma can make you feel like you're experiencing that trauma yourself, especially if you've had that trauma experience before. Or even seeing trauma on the news or on social media, which, as we know, is even more prevalent now and will probably result in just different complex issues as we become more aware of it. But, we're so connected to the 24-hour news cycle in a way that human beings are just not created to handle. We're not meant to be absorbing so much information about a world that we don't have control over entirely. And so it's a lot of information for our brains to process, and it's stressful and it's traumatizing. So so that's just one first thing I wanted to like get out of the way, is that we can experience trauma symptoms from something that happens to us, but it can also be something we see happen to someone else. It can also be something we hear about happening to someone else, and it can be something that we see happen on the news or on social media. Trauma can also be something that has happened long ago. It doesn't even have to be happening in the present. It can be something that has happened to someone in our family, or happened to someone within like our identity groups, or in a group that we identify with. The way I think there's two different types of trauma in this lens is generational trauma and historical trauma. And generational trauma is, from my perspective, the idea of kind of passed down trauma symptoms from a great grandparent to a grandparent to a parent to the child. And we see that a lot with like people that survived the Great Depression, that they experienced such an intense time of scarcity that they kind of carry over that trauma and feel as if things might become scarce again. So they might hoard and collect items that they don't really need, but they hang on to it just in case. And we'll see that symptom of hoarding passed down through generations, so that you'll see, a child or even a grandchild hoarding goods because their parent or grandparent taught them to do so, because you just never know, right? The stress of, you just never know, people might take your stuff, or you just never know, like there might be nothing tomorrow, so you have to hang on to what you have, which is a very understandable, very real, very legitimate fear for someone that lived through the Great Depression. But for a child that has food available to them, who has things available to them, if they're hoarding food under their bed, that's just not healthy. It probably is attracting ants. There's probably a lot of other secondary issues to that. But it's not their own trauma that they are manifesting the symptoms to. It's actually their grandparent or great-grandparent's trauma. So we can see that happen with people. We can also see historical trauma, which is, I think of as trauma passed through identities, or passed through like cultural narratives or stories, people's understanding of themselves as a group and how trauma has influenced an entire group's identity or experience. And so we see that with lots of different groups. You can see that in the way that indigenous tribes have kind of developed over the years because of the intense genocide and trauma that was committed against them in the beginning of the United States. You can see that with Jewish people and survivors of the Holocaust, that there's a sense of shared experience of trauma within an entire cultural group that then affects the way that entire group talks about their identity or their experiences. And you might see symptoms of that passed on to people that have not been through the specific kind of historical trauma, but they carry, remnants of it with them. And then the way that I think and talk about trauma a lot with the work that I do now with refugees and immigrants is around migration, and that migration in and of itself can be traumatizing or traumatic, depending on how someone migrates, right? If you are lucky enough to get deemed a refugee early on from, wherever you are, and you get to hop on a plane and come to, wherever you're being resettled, the 2-hour flight or the, 1 day of flight in an airplane might not hold a lot of trauma in that migration. But someone who has to travel on foot across several countries, or travel in caravan, or travel great distances on their own, even, just statistically, right, the longer time it takes them to travel and the longer their migration is, the higher risk of experiencing some form of trauma. But we just know that there are also greater risks for different types of trauma, like violence or assault, in that sort of like travel on foot or by car. But we also know that for someone to be deemed a refugee, there has to be some sort of forcible displacement. So to be forcibly displaced from your home is inherently traumatic because it's forcible, like no one's choosing to leave. And the reason for that displacement, the catalyst for that migration, is also a form of trauma of some kind, whether it's community violence or war, gang violence, religious or political persecution, or some sort of, violence or death or conflict. And so that is a form of trauma. And then I think the piece of this kind of timeline or kind of flow chart that people forget is once they're in the city or place where they're being resettled, there's a lot of trauma. Sometimes people will say like even more traumatizing there because the other traumas they experienced in their life was like normal trauma. It was trauma that they had come to expect or they were prepared for. Whereas some of the, I call it acculturation stress or acculturation trauma, the trauma of resettling is new. It's foreign to them. It's something maybe they weren't expecting. It can be really isolating in a way that maybe their other traumas created. They had other people that knew what it was like. They might be the only person who's going through that trauma when they're being resettled. So acculturation stress can include isolation or racism or Islamophobia, which is the fear of Muslim people, xenophobia, which is the fear of anyone that's different from you. It can also include, being a victim of a crime or physical assault or community violence or microaggressions. And microaggressions are just small, seemingly innocuous things that people say that kind of undermine your dignity or your kind of belongingness in a community, right? The common one is asking someone, well, where are you from? Where are you really from? On its face, it might be a fine question. And most of the time it might be a totally fine question. But for someone, if they hear that all the time, and especially if they're from wherever you are, hearing where are you from implies that they're not from their home, which is implying that they don't belong, implying that they're different. And, to hear that over and over again would be harmful or, upsetting for someone, traumatizing. So now I'm not a neuroscientist or a brain expert by any means, but there's some parts of the brain that I think are really important and really powerful to talk about when we think about trauma. So the first thing I just want to address is two important parts of the brain when we talk about trauma. The first is the prefrontal cortex. So that's the front of your brain. And that's responsible for all your kind of higher thinking, your complex thought, your abstract thought, your reasoning, logic, anything you'd be expected to do in school, like learning and doing complex equations, like that's happening in the front of your brain. And the other part is your amygdala, and that's the back part of your brain. And the amygdala is like our survival instinct. It's like, fight, flight, or freeze. It's your just basic, like, I just need to live past this minute sort of function. And when something bad happens or when we sense a threat, our prefrontal cortex shuts off. Because, for example, when a car is driving towards us and we have to get out of the way, we don't need to calculate the velocity of the car to figure out that we need to jump out of the way. What we need to do is either decide, do I fight the car, do I run from the car, or do I hide from the car? And most of us would decide to probably run or like jump out of the way. And that's because our amygdala kind of taps in. So our prefrontal cortex, the front of our brain, shuts off. The back of our brain takes over and says, okay, I got this. Like, we'll get this done. We'll get you survived. And that works. That works when the threat is there, when it's real, in stressful moments. But what happens when people go through a lot of trauma or when they experience a lot of stress, your brain is basically constantly being told, front smart part of your brain, shut off, we don't need you. Back part of the brain, like, you run the show, you're in charge because we need to survive. And when that happens, it's just like any muscle. For those of you that can see the graphic that I've made, I'm very proud of it. That it's like a muscle, right? The more we work a muscle, the stronger it gets. And so the brain is the same way. The more we use the back part of our brain, the stronger it gets. And the less we use the front part of our brain, the weaker it gets. And so what you see happening is, in a healthy brain, if I sense a threat, my brain will, gather some information, make sure the threat's real, and then it'll, shut the front part of my brain off and the back will take over. What happens though is, in a traumatized brain, because the front part is so weak, it can't gather the information it needs to figure out if the threat's real or if it's okay, or even to help calm the body down when it's not, when the threat isn't real. And so the survival part of our brain just takes over, and the front part of our brain is too weak to kind of respond. And so we live our life in a constant state of survival, which is exhausting and can lead us to make some poorly informed decisions because we're operating from this sense of urgency, from this sense of survival. So, for example, if we imagine living every moment of our life in this sort of survival mode, and some of us, this might be very real because we might do this, or this might happen to us throughout our day. But imagine, your alarm clock goes off in the morning and suddenly you have to be in fight or flight. You don't know where that alarm is. You don't know what's happening, or you have to move, right? Or you hear the garbage truck outside and it puts you on edge and you just can't calm down because the front part of your brain, the smart part, the part that would help you calm down, is too weak to help you calm down. So then the back part of your brain, the amygdala, is just driving the car the rest of the time. It's running the show, and you're never going to escape from that perceived threat because you don't know how to calm yourself down. You might see that while you're working, or when there's some sort of even, ambiguous social interaction. The example they use a lot in trauma trainings is when kids line up for a fire drill at school. The fire drill itself is kind of stressful, so they're triggered. They go into fight, flight, or freeze, right? They go into that sort of survival response. And then they're standing in line and a kid bumps them, and immediately they go into fight, flight, or freeze. So they might choose to fight the kid. They might choose to maybe run away from school and not come back, and that will get them into trouble. Or they might choose to shut down and maybe they don't participate in class the rest of the day, and they might get in trouble for that. But here's one example of how their response, even though if we understand the brain function of it, it makes sense, it's not helping them survive these other situations because it's pushing them to respond in ways that aren't helpful, that aren't healthy. And so what that can lead to is difficulty understanding ourselves or other people, right? If I am constantly living in survival and I'm either fighting people, I'm running away from people, or I'm shutting down, that's not going to help me build healthy relationships with people. I also might get in trouble at school for things that I don't quite understand because I shut down and teachers are telling me to participate, but I feel like I can't because it feels like I threaten my survival if I do something, right? Or you know, if we're constantly fighting people, I mean, no one wants to be friends with the kid that's always fighting people. And so we might kind of develop this disconnect from ourselves or from other people. And unfortunately, a lot of ways that people deal with that disconnect is by self-medicating or by avoiding or numbing that discomfort through drinking or drugs or multiple sexual partners or other illegal sort of like thrill-seeking behaviors like stealing or driving while intoxicated or things like that. And this is not to say that having a beer is a horrible thing. I'm not making a judgment on that one way or the other. It just isn't, it's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to make this person closer to their social peers to be doing some of these things. It's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, right? It's not solving the root of the issue. And that's what makes it unhealthy coping. And what we know about trauma through countless research, but specifically with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, is that people with 6 or more adverse childhood experiences are just experiences of trauma before the age of 18. So people with 6 or more traumatic experiences died nearly 20 years earlier on average than those without traumatic experiences because of the unhealthy coping that they developed, because of the health risks and complications associated with binge drinking or using drugs, things like that. And so untreated trauma, and this is all when trauma is left untreated, when we're not dealing with it, when we're not addressing the root, the bullet wound under the Band-Aid. That when it's left untreated, I mean, it takes decades of our lives. And that's a problem. That's a problem for people that want to help others. It's a problem for people who care about those who have experienced trauma. And it's a problem for us as a society, as a community, when we look at how much trauma is happening in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our communities, because it's taking away good lives that could be productive, that could be contributing to who we are as a community. Okay, so that was a lot. That was a lot of information. Are we good so far? Again, please interrupt. The next kind of big chunk, and I know we're kind of going through a lot, but the next chunk we're going to be talking about is cultural sensitivity. And so when I talk about cultural sensitivity, I love bringing back that word humility. I love talking about cultural humility because I think that really puts it into perspective, that this is a lens, it's a framework through which to see the world. It's not something like a checklist. It's not something we ever attain. It's something that we just bring to every interaction, which can be frustrating when you want a checklist, when you want it to be simple and kind of like check, 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 done. But it really is, it's a lifelong process. It's a lifelong process of asking questions of others, but probably more importantly, asking questions of ourselves. It's a lifelong process of critically engaging with ourselves, with our community, with organizations and groups that we are part of, and just constantly committing to learning more and being open to learning more. And so, you know, I say ask questions I think that that's probably the most powerful tool. I think we forget how powerful and simple asking questions can be, and asking direct questions, you know, being unafraid of asking the wrong question or asking in a way that, you know, might offend. But if we are truly coming from a place of sincerity and authenticity, asking questions to be a better support to someone, I think will never yield a bad result. With that though, too, you know, I mean, it requires some radical honesty with ourselves, most importantly, radical honesty, because I need to be honest with myself. Why am I asking a question? Or why am I doing this? Or why does this, you know, upset me? Or, you know, if we're not being radically honest, sometimes people are just curious because they're like, oh, that's so different, I want to know more. Well, if it's not, you know, pertinent to the work that I'm doing, you know, wanting to know more just for the sake of like, it's so foreign to me, it's so different, that's not maybe appropriate. You know, that can be othering in a different way. But if it's, you know, productive for whatever work, whatever purpose brings you together with a person, then that's appropriate, right? But to have that radical honesty, to ask ourselves, okay, why do I need to know this? Do I need to know this for my work, or am I just asking this because? Or, you know, that sort of critical engagement with ourselves and with our own motivation. Educating ourselves is another thing that, while the internet might have its many issues and might bring all of its other problems, like we talked about with exposure to the news and social media, it also is a great wealth of knowledge. And there's so many books and podcasts and videos that can teach us about different perspectives on an issue or different groups of people. We don't have to expect someone in our lives to teach us everything, and we shouldn't. It's not my Black friend's job to teach me about the experience of Black folks, or it's not my one, you know, female's job to teach me everything there is to know about being a woman, or, you know, like that's not the role that people need to play in our lives, and that's not fair of us to expect of anyone that has a different identity than our own. There's so many resources available to us that we can educate ourselves. We can find books, we can read, we can watch videos, we can listen to podcasts, we can attend workshops and presentations like this that can help us broaden our awareness, but that's not the responsibility of our friends or family or coworkers or anything like that. Now, if they want to, that's a different thing, but to expect that of others is not fair. Like I said before, embracing that discomfort. Part of cultural humility is not having the answer. So when I sit down with a client for the first time and they say they speak such and such language, or they're from this place in this country, and if I don't know where that is, I can't fake it till I make it. I have to admit when I don't know something, or if they say something and I don't understand. You know, embracing the discomfort of not knowing and just admitting that is really relieving and can be very liberating to just let people know when you don't know, and to ask for their input, or to say, you know, well, what would you prefer, or what do you think is best? You know, opening up that conversation can be really powerful, not only when we talk about culture, but when we talk about trauma, or when we talk about different identities, right? Like that humility, that discomfort is really important. And then the last one, I think probably the most important, is being flexible and creative when we can, because I think too often sometimes our systems become very inflexible, become very rigid. You know, we have a process by which we do things and that's it. But that usually is made for a very specific type of person. And the moment you deviate from that identity in any way, then additional barriers start to add up. A simple example that I talk about a lot recently is, you know, with different public governmental meetings that happen during the workday. The moment that you don't make your own schedule, then all these barriers start to pop up. So now you work a 9 to 5, you can't go to any meetings, even though they're open to the public. You can't go to any meetings that happen during the workday because you work 9 to 5, and maybe you work a minimum wage job where you don't control your schedule. And if you miss a day, your boss will cut you because they can find someone else to do your job. So, you know, when we have power in systems, or in whatever power and capacity we do have, to create flexibility, to have some creativity, can be really powerful. Because just because it's not the way we do it doesn't mean it's wrong. And I think that requires some humility because we like to think that our way is the best way, but that's not always true. Sometimes different is fine. So that was a very quick kind of overview of those three things. I did just want to make sure that I gave enough time to review these sorts of action steps, right? How do we apply this? So we've gone over a lot of information, and what do you do with it now? So I'll start at the micro level. Social workers, we love our micro, meso, macro, divide of issues. So on a micro level, when we address trauma triggers, if you're interacting with someone, whether it's yourself that feels triggered, if you feel like you're kind of going back into that back part of your brain, you're going into survival, you can sense that you're getting stressed. Or if you can see it happening in someone else, you can see that something that happened is causing them to tense, or something you said is causing them to bristle. There's a lot of different things you can do. The first thing is to identify and remove the trigger, or remove the person from the triggering environment, or address the trigger in some way. Sometimes we think that avoiding a topic will just make it go away, and that's not how it works. Definitely not with trauma triggers. One example I use is a woman once told me that she had a client who, I think he was a veteran, and so he was on high alert when he came into buildings. He had been trained to just always expect the worst, and so he was always triggered in a new place. And when he came into a new building, he wanted to know where all the exits were. And she was trying to complete the intake paperwork with him, and he was tense, and he had told her that. And she later asked me, how could she have helped? And I said, well, could you have walked him around the building and showed him the exits? I mean, that might have taken 15 minutes, maybe to 20 minutes to go around the whole building, show him where the exits are. And then you could have come back to your office, and maybe that would have helped assuage some of those fears, addressed that trigger, removed the trigger maybe, or removed that sort of stressor, and you could have completed your intake paperwork. I know taking a tour of the office is not part of the intake session, but maybe for that client it was, because it helped you kind of address that. It helped him be in a space to answer the intake questions, and it helped build trust and rapport in that. So being creative and flexible in that, I think, is important. The get down on their level and meet them where they are. Two different things here. Meet them where they are is, kind of addressing people on the issues that they care about, or if there's something that they're concerned about, whether we're talking about, like I said, trauma triggers with that client, or if we're talking about someone that, has a really extreme, trauma need or medical need or transportation barrier, that sometimes, even if that's not related to the work that you need to be doing with them, helping them address an issue that's important to them will help reduce the stress around that trauma, around that stressor. It will also help build trust and rapport, and it'll help you connect and kind of get past that, so you can actually do the work you want. Because the reality is if you don't address it, it'll just stay there. It'll keep, distracting them from whatever work you need to be doing. But getting down on their level is more, I think, about with kids. When I work with kids, is, standing up above a child is a pretty intimidating posture to take, and that even the simple act of sitting down next to them or kneeling down in front of them is a really powerful tool to just create that sort of connection. Being at eye level is really important for us as humans. No one likes to feel like looked down upon or kind of like in a power stance. That's not comfortable. The next is to bring people back to the present. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of ground yourself in the here and now. You can do mindfulness exercises. You can do grounding exercises, noticing all the things you can hear in a room, or taking deep breaths, or, holding hands, or noticing physical touch. So maybe holding hands isn't appropriate for some people's work. But even asking someone to play with Play-Doh and talk about how the Play-Doh feels, or touch, a squishy ball, or, there's all these different kind of tactile toys that you can have that can help bring someone back to their physical experience. And then the last one that I really love is to give a person water. And this works for ourselves as well. When we start to feel stressed or when someone else starts to feel stressed, we might start to feel a little overheated. Being nervous for a presentation, I was a little overheated. and your breathing might increase, right? You might start to breathe a little faster. Your heart will start to race. And it's hard to catch your breath. And I think sometimes the worst thing you can tell to someone that is upset is to tell them to calm down. And the second worst thing you can tell them is to take a deep breath, because we kind of know that that's like the same idea. And that sometimes telling someone to take a deep breath when they can't catch their breath is actually more stressful, because then now they can't catch their breath and you're telling them to catch their breath and they can't do that. And it becomes this kind of vicious cycle. But the great thing about drinking water is that you have to catch your breath in order to drink water. I can't keep hyperventilating if I drink water. So it's almost like a subconscious way to control our breathing in order to drink. A cold glass of water is especially helpful because it's cooling our body from the inside out, right? So now instead of my body kind of heating up and getting ready for fighting, running, hiding, my body is cooling down through a cold glass of water. And we know that drinking that water is going to help, us control our breath. It's going to help bring oxygen to our brain, which is going to help the front part of our brain operate better and function. So it all around is kind of like soothing us in the most like basic physical way possible. And I've used that especially on kids. It's really helpful when you have someone having a tantrum. Getting them a glass of water is not something they expect you to offer when you're trying to like get them to calm down. And it really has worked in the past. And the reality is that people who experience trauma, or children, because I do a lot of work with kids and teens, we need stability, reliability, consistency. So routines and rituals, or warnings of change, signals of change, letting us know when something's going to change, or when someone new is going to be here, or if we're going to have a change in our plans, right? Anything that helps kind of create stability and consistency removes a lot of the other additional stressors beyond whatever is also stressing this child out or this person out related to their trauma. If we can remove some of the other stressors, like unexpected change or inconsistency, we can really work on like the root of the problem. Connection is the other thing. I mean, everyone wants connection, but that can be even more powerful for people when they've experienced a trauma, because it can be so disconnecting, right? Like I said, if you feel like you're constantly trying to survive, you might not feel like you can understand yourself or other people. And so making connection intentionally can be really powerful. And I think that that's also true for cultural diversity too. Looking at this first example, knowing and pronouncing names correctly is a really powerful way to connect with people. And sometimes when people speak a different language, or their name is not a name we're used to saying, it can be uncomfortable to admit, like, I'm not good at saying this name. But to continue to use the name or practice and just keep trying is really powerful. We love to hear our names. Like, our brains light up when we hear our name, because it's us. It's important to us. And so using people's names is really powerful tool for connecting with them. Smiling at people, shaking hands, hugging when appropriate, depending on whatever role, we're operating within, saying hello. And then, creating some sense of calm is really important for people, whether that's a calm moment where you just maybe have a moment of silence to calm down between sessions, or providing a space for calm. Some classrooms now will have calm down corners where a child can, when they're feeling stressed or having a tantrum, can go into the calm down corner, and there's pillows and soft rug and maybe a fidget toy that they can, sit and, kind of let their hands do the busy work while their mind calms down. So those can be really important, really powerful. Again, not only for other people if we're working with people that might have experienced trauma, but also for ourselves, because trauma is pretty common. Most people have experienced at least one type of trauma in their life. And so we all probably will benefit from some of this or all of this. So finding time to put calm moments into our life is really powerful. Addressing diversity. Okay, I know I'm getting close to time, so I'm going to go a little faster. I knew I wasn't going to make it through all this. On a micro level, I think it's important that we work towards acceptance, not tolerance. Tolerance implies that you like tolerate someone, so they're not good, but you like put up with it, versus acceptance, which is embracing someone for their whole being, and still, you know, including them within whatever definition of community we're looking at. I think attainable goals is super important, and having input in the goals is important. You know, when we're working with people or you know, goal setting, sometimes we put a ton on people's plates, and sometimes, whether it's because of a cultural difference or because of trauma or because of a different type of intersection of identities, sometimes having too many goals is overwhelming. And so really focusing on one thing at a time and encouraging those strengths that people already have is just a really simple, basic way that we can apply this to any type of diversity we might come in contact with. Like I said, you know, be comfortable in the uncomfortable, ask clear questions, you know, try to incorporate creativity or flexibility. And then step forward, step back. It's this idea of, if I tend to talk more in a situation, I need to step back. If I tend not to talk a lot in these situations, maybe it's time I step forward and I speak up, because I might bring words to something that someone else is experiencing. So that's another powerful tool, I think. On a group or organizational level, on that meso level, I think we can address this intersectionality through a lot of different lenses. The first is call in, don't call out. So I got this from someone I went to college with, but this idea that when you call someone out, you're kind of like wagging your finger at them, and can be a little condescending, it can be a little judgmental. And usually when you call someone out, the walls come up. So if you're trying to connect with someone, if you're trying to change someone's mind, you really don't need to call them out, because that will have the opposite effect. What you need to do is call them in for a conversation, call them into a discussion, and really approach it with respect and as two equals, not as someone that like knows better than them, and to call them out on something. And to ask basic questions, right? Ask who's missing from this discussion. Why do we have these limitations? Why do we have these rules? How can we change or bring more people into this discussion? And then at a macro level, right, this policy level, this kind of community-wide level, I think one piece is like to not leave policy to individual strengths. We can't rely on one good person to see the importance of diversity and equity and inclusion and just expect that they will just always be there to make sure that that's on the agenda or that that's applied. We need to make sure that policies clearly state how we apply these concepts or these supports for trauma-informed care and cultural sensitivity into the work we do. And that I think you can advocate for specific policies on every level. I think the most powerful one and the quickest one is on a local level. So you can still address the big picture, you can still address the here and now, the immediate needs of people, but it's faster. It's not bogged down by all the same things that statewide and national politics and government have to deal with. But that local people, local groups, local government has a lot of potential there. You can have one-on-one meetings with your local elected officials. You can call them, you can write letters, you can rally to raise awareness for issues. So there's a lot you can do on a local level around whatever sort of change you want to see, depending on what. I know we have a lot of different people in this, so depending on whatever lens you bring or whatever issue you kind of rally around. So yeah, okay. Whew. Okay, 1 minute left. So that was a lot of information. I hope that there was something there to take away, something new. If you have any questions, we can review them now or say them out loud, whatever works.
That was a lot of information, Lydia, but it was really great. And you definitely went through it well. It all makes sense.
Okay, good.
Does anybody have any questions? You could put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. Well, I do see that there is contact information provided for you on the screen. I'm going to venture a guess and say Lydia wouldn't mind if you reach out to her with any questions later.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love talking about these with specific issues. It's hard to make a presentation because there's so much that can be done. So if there's a specific issue or topic you want to dive deeper into and talk about how this can apply to that, I would love to. Please reach out to my email or give me a call.
Fantastic. Well, that wraps it up for today, everyone. Thank you for attending, and we will start tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Have a good night.